Okay, good afternoon. Great turnout. Welcome to the fourth installment of the CrySP Speaker Series on Privacy for the year. Today's talk is presented jointly with Sociology and Legal Studies. I see a lot of legal studies people in the room, as well as people from CS, math, philosophy. So lots, great turnout. Thanks, guys. So today's speaker is Dr. Kerr from the University of Ottawa. He is the Canada Research Chair in Law, Ethics, and Technology there at the University of Ottawa. He is well known for his research in privacy, surveillance, human rights, and today he will be talking to us about some stuff he's been working on recently on the convergence of people and machines and the societal and legal issues therein. So let's welcome Dr. Kerr.
I'm going to talk to you today in one sense about some of the developments with medical devices in enhancement medicine, but more particularly about some of their broader implications for privacy and for human autonomy. And my motto, my thought is a sort of a piece of advice for people who are presenting for the first or second time. You know, if you want to sort of set the bar right and then make sure to achieve that, start with a premise that is based on a very bad movie and go from there, because it can only go up. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about this notion of the Repo men coming, more particularly in talking about new forms of bodily privacy that we're going to have to worry about as we start more and more to merge humans and machines. So in thinking about this, I'm very interested in what I see as a continuum of issues in what I see as a human-machine merger. More and more, we're seeing on one end of the continuum, which is what I'm going to focus on today, we're seeing the actual implantation of medical devices and machine parts into people. The cyborg side of the spectrum, if you will. At the other end of the spectrum, we're also giving human attributes more and more to machine systems, the robot end of the spectrum. My research is very much at various points along the continuum. Today I'm going to talk more at the part where we are putting machine parts into people. And in doing so, some of this research develops around some issues I've been thinking around in what I guess I would call the development of digital body parts, prosthetics. I've been talking about this stuff for about 10 years. I remember when I was talking about Oscar Pistorius and nobody in the room had heard of him. And so we reached sort of a watermark with Oscar Pistorius having run in the Olympics this year and having seen sort of where things are going. And it was very interesting to watch that debate about people on the one hand saying he shouldn't be in the Olympics because he's disabled, and on the other hand saying he shouldn't be in the Olympics because he has an unfair advantage, because his prosthetic limbs actually enhance his position. And in thinking about these issues, this is actually a larger part of a project that I'm interested in where our goal is the technological mastery of the human body and some of its ethical and legal implications. And in thinking about those issues, some of the questions that come up that I'm going to talk about today focus around privacy. That should be fairly obvious as I move into the talk. And more about a concept that you don't hear much in this space, which is a legal concept. It's enshrined in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that is the concept of the security of the person. So in thinking sort of about those issues, I want to start with this idea of the Repo men coming. So here we go.
It's compact, it's safe, it's comfortable, everything you want in a new liver. The price, $756,000.
Let me just reassure you, the Archivist Department will find a plan that fits your lifestyle.
He'll sign it. Everybody signs it. But what they don't tell you is if you can't pay the bills, some union man will break into your house and reclaim our property.
I keep paying. Sorry, that's not my department. Get up. Put your hand out of eggs.
My name's Remy. That's my best friend, Jake. We grew up together, and now we work together.
That's what to do.
And what do you think keeps the world together?
It's rules. It's people abiding by the terms, by the bills that they sign themselves.
How's your pancreas holding up? I sent the money in this morning. We're always good with you, Repo.
From the IRS?
Nah, they won't give me a new audit.
Nah, no real credit history.
Okay, he'll sign it, everyone signs it. What do you think keeps a world together? It's rules. It's people abiding by the terms of the deals that they have signed for themselves. I want you to think about that as we start to think about this notion of the commodification of the body and its mastery in a health domain context. So I use the Repo Man example as a kind of reductio ad absurdum, or actually I've tried to flip that on its head. The computer scientists, the philosophers, people with no argument schemes will be familiar with this concept. But it's an argument strategy. It says if you want to make an argument to prove the falsity of something, you assume it to be true, and then you show that it somehow leads to some kind of incoherence or contradiction, and then you can conclude the opposite. So I thought it's kind of interesting to think, is the Repo Men scenario, is that a reductio ad absurdum? Is that just silliness that's going on here? Is this science fiction, entertainment, or is this more and more like science fact? And I started to take that one on fairly seriously in thinking about this and the real advances that we've had in the past couple of years about medical technologies. And I've had some really good discussions yesterday with some people who are working on those applications, both in the computer science field and then some other people with sort of interrelated disciplines since I've been at Waterloo. And in thinking about that, I teach a course at the University of Ottawa that I call Building Better Humans. Notice the question mark, it's the most important part of the title. But it raises this question about the technological mastery of the body, and in particular, the goal that is characteristic of a particular school of thought. That's not hydrogen, folks. That's the symbol for transhumanism. Okay, H+, humanity plus. People who belong to this interesting and emerging school of thought have the actual belief that we have a moral obligation to use technology to transcend our biological condition. That we no longer leave things to natural selection, that we move towards a model of deliberative selection as we are able to master technology and to enhance our bodies through it and to transcend our biology as a result. In thinking about those kinds of things, some of my work has been around artificial organs. I just want to show you a few of the ones that are really interesting. This is an early prototype of an artificial liver system. And some of these are quite beautiful to look at. This one is in a really early stage and hasn't sort of been fully developed. This is, of course, a Berlin heart, and its function not quite so pretty in many ways to look at, but it's a bridge. It's a bridge for people who need an organ transplant, whether that organ transplant is going to be biological or synthetic down the road. And the idea here is that this device will not allow people to have, as might be obvious from the picture, a high quality of life. It's not the end game in this. This is a bridge to either an organ transplant or some new technology that will come along that will allow for that kind of function. And we've seen developments like that. This is a ventricular assist device which has actually performed that role. When it was developed, it was thought that it would only be a bridging device. And what we've actually seen is that it's an enhancement device. It's a device which has been used to allow people to both restore and maintain previous function, and in some ways actually have their cardiovascular system perform better than it would have had they had their healthy heart intact in the first place. So we're at a really interesting time in thinking about these systems. This is a portable or wearable, I guess you could call it artificial kidney system, a dialysis system. This is a bio-lung. And this is an artificial pancreas, about which I had a very interesting conversation with Dr. McKillop the other day about things that happened at Waterloo, in particular with this system. I've been showing this slide for a few years, and last year when I taught this course in Puerto Rico, one of my students put up their hand, and then she raised her shirt. She only raised it to here. She raised her shirt and she showed me that she was actually wearing one of these devices. This stuff has gone from sort of the drawing board to actual use in a fairly short range of time. We have artificial eyes, we have artificial ears, and I'm going to talk more about those right now actually. Cochlear implants is going to be a really interesting thing to think about as the next generation of cochlear implants takes place. Right now, cochlear implants are really a fairly primitive restorative or therapeutic technology. In other words, they can restore some lost, and watch me here, I've got the scare quotes out, I'm on my tippy toes, lost hearing. And I'm putting hearing in scare quotes here because what it is actually is an analog of hearing. It allows for people who use these devices to interpret sound in their environment, but it's not exactly the same as the hearing that, for example, they might have had previously if they had late onset hearing issues. And so in thinking about this, I want to just say a little bit about it, talk about it in terms of the medical model, talk about the cochlear implant as one of my examples for now. This is a sort of a very small computer system here, and people here will be very familiar with the kinds of things that are happening with respect to the processor. But the point is, with a lot of these technologies, there's a piece that's an external piece, and this is the external piece for the cochlear implant. It looks quite a bit like, there's a lot of hearing aids that look like that now as well. And one of the things that's been interesting about watching this field is how these kinds of devices have actually, so to speak, normalized insofar as young kids don't feel the same stigma as they might have wearing a hearing aid 20 years ago. These things look a lot like the kind of thing that the Terminator would wear, that bouncers at the bars you go to would wear. And there's, now they start to have sort of iPod-ish colors and packaging and the like. And there's a real sort of symbolism there in terms of the commodification of health devices in this kind of way. So without taking you back to grade 5, which is probably where you saw this picture the first time, I think I remember seeing one like that. What's going on here in the issue with people who wear cochlear implants is that there is a magical spot right here between the little bones, as Tragically Hip might put it, and the cochlea, where something magical happens in the domain of hearing, which is that mechanical sound, which is sort of comes in and is funneled in through our ears, is translated into digital sound that the brain can then understand. And when there's a physiological impairment that prevents that, what happens with the cochlear implant when that part is no longer physiologically functional is a very interventionist activity. What happens is a fairly violent thing, which is that the person who performs the procedure actually severs the auditory nerve. This is a one-way road. This means there's no going back to using analog hearing after one, at least at this point in time, after one goes forward with this sort of procedure. And the idea is that we do an end run around the physiological impairment through computer technologies, in essence. It's amazing. You have a part of the device that's actually on the inside of the skull, which is interfacing with the external part. And that part interfaces ultimately with the central nervous system, circumvents the impairment taking place in the cochlea, and allowing people to have an analog of hearing. This is a guy who knows all too well about this. His name is Michael Korost, and he is an interesting guy. He wrote, if you're interested, just Google him on Wired and find his article that's called My Bionic Quest for Bolero, where he's a high-fidelity aficionado who slowly lost his hearing over the years and has subsequently gone on to write a book which talks about what it's like to sort of live with the merger of humans and machines, having in essence a computer processor installed in his brain. Here's what he said. He said, "I no longer doubt that incredible things can be done with that unused 90% part of my implant's hardware capacity. Tests conducted a month after my visit to Advanced Bionics, who's the cochlear implant provider, show that my ability to discriminate among notes has improved considerably. With high res," that was the old software running his cochlear implant, "I was able to identify notes only when they were at least 70 hertz apart. Now I can hear notes that are only 30 hertz apart. It's like going from being able to tell the difference between red and blue to going to be able to distinguish between aquamarine and cobalt. My hearing is no longer limited by the physical circumstances of my body. While my friends' ears will inevitably decline with age, mine will only get better." And so I think in many ways, Michael Korost is kind of a poster child for this view of using technology to enhance the human body eventually. I mean, it's a therapeutic attempt right now, but there's enhancement opportunities and possibilities in all of this. So in thinking about this in the time that I have with you, I want to talk not just about the medical models of what's going on with these devices, but more in my field with some of the legal implications that arise from the technology. In other words, the techno-legal models that we have to layer on top of the medical model so that we don't just wow ourselves with the power of the device and what it can do in terms of transfiguring human biology, but so that we can look at the social implications of, in essence, sticking computing devices in our heads and the like. So in thinking about that, it's sort of useful to think about this guy and people like him. This is Kevin Warwick. Anybody heard of Kevin Warwick in the room? He's a professor of cybernetics in the UK at Reading University. And he's not about to have an arm wrestling competition with that robotic arm. In fact, what he would rather do is collaborate with it. So he was involved in a series of experiments, many of which were self-experiments, which is an interesting way to get around ethics review boards when you do things to yourself. And he did a series of cybernetic experiments starting back in 2002. And what he did was he took a device that you can sort of see down there at the bottom by his arm that's called a neural transducer. It's an amazing little device. What this device is it's a router for the body. Okay? So it can take signals sent by the brain and moving through somebody's central nervous system, and it can take them and it can route them outside of the body so that those signals can be shared, processed, understood, transmitted, broadcast, received, collected, archived, stored, all of that sort of thing for various different purposes. So you can imagine if he was at his university in Reading, and what he's now going to do with this neural transducer, which has been implanted into his arm, is we're going to say that the robotic arm is here in Waterloo, and inside the hand is the egg. And he's at his university in Reading, and he's thinking about cracking the egg. Okay? So he thinks about that, and as he thinks about that, his brain sends a signal that ultimately goes through the open internet, comes here ultimately, and the robotic arm cracks the egg. Some of the legal studies people in the room, not the computer scientists, but the legal studies people in the room are saying to themselves, well, there's one overfunded academic. What's going on here? Well, on the one hand, you might sort of see that's sort of a very fancy thing to do, but if you take a moment or two and think about it, you will see, in fact, that this is something which has tremendous applications, for example, in the field of dealing with people with paralysis or certain kinds of impairment of their central nervous system. Because the idea is that you can use technology to do an end run around whatever the impairment is in the body so that the signal sent from the brain get to where they would have got had that impairment not been there. And we're seeing all sorts of examples like this. More recently, Kevin Warwick and his wife are trying to actually do telepathy. They're trying to communicate through these wireless devices. You thought Facebook was a social network. So they're actually trying to do these kinds of things, but it's kind of interesting to think about this. And it's interesting to think about it in the sense of the world that we live in now, which is the world of Wi-Fi, the world of ad hoc social networks. And of course, what I mean by that is a world where our devices come to speak to one another, if you will. They communicate with one another. And they don't do that because they were part of a prefigured network, which is what used to happen in my day, in the early days of the internet. Now they can do it through sensing devices in ways that you can set up ad hoc networks, by which I mean networks of devices which nobody ever contemplated would necessarily configure themselves together, but because they've come in proximity of one another, they form a new kind of network. And so we already know about those kind of things in the way that we network our devices. But what we're starting to see in an interesting way is that we're moving away from the early days of local area networks of the sort that I was talking about. My law school, when I used to send email, all the terminals were wired to one another, and it was a big deal. I could send email to somebody else at another terminal. And that was part of a local area network. We've moved from local area networks, of course, to wider area networks such as the internet, which we now take for granted. But my interest is around something that moves in the other direction, which you might call a personal area network. The idea that there's this space around 1 meter or 2 meters around the human body, which becomes a little network of its own with all sorts of these devices, a cochlear implant you can imagine, and other devices networked together, and what the implications of this kind of networking are. So I've been thinking about this quite a bit in the context of a range of devices. I've already sort of mentioned the insulin pumps and sensors, which actually people at Waterloo know a lot about because that technology was worked on significantly here. These kinds of things, as well as the cochlear implants that I've talked about, as well as others. And we can start to imagine what these things look like when we add those devices to the network. So now all of a sudden, cochlear implants version 2, not the kind that are right now being used, but the kind that are around the corner, are going to be internet enabled, right? And they're going to be able to be attached as nodes to a network. And they're going to be able to interface with other sort of more mass market consumer goods like iPods and iPads. And you can already use some of these devices and plug them into other kinds of devices. So it's really interesting to sort of start to think about this. What happens, for example, when all of a sudden you could offer to a group of undergraduates, let's say, high fidelity hearing mainlined directly into their brain? What would they do to get unlimited free high fidelity music? What would you do? Right? And we just looked at old models. We looked at what's our old model for music share delivery? Radio. What's radio? Radio is free music in exchange for tolerated messaging. Except now this is going on in the head, and it's unclear yet what the switches will look like, the on-off switches, and like, I'm just playing around here. But in any event, it does get interesting to start thinking about this idea of a personal area network that not only has these kind of consumer goods that we're talking about, but that adds these medical devices, which is what I see happening in the next round of these devices, and thinking about what some of the social implications for that will look like. Well, obviously, I think it's trite to say, it goes almost without saying, that the nature of the information exchange becomes heightened, right? Right now, people in my field who work on areas of privacy, lawyers thinking about data security breaches and privacy breaches and the like, we already don't know what to do with big data breaches involving things like credit card numbers. Or into hacking into email accounts, all right? What about what happens when we start to include things that includes, for example, real-time physiology, people's blood sugar levels, people's blood alcohol levels, all of these kinds of things which through sensor and monitoring devices could become part of these personal area networks that we're talking about. And so clearly, I think it goes without saying that security and privacy needs are going to have to be heightened. But I'm interested in sort of looking at the broader issue here and thinking about the data flows in and out of the personal area networks. And so in terms of sort of thinking about this, I imagine some of these things, and I try to just work with examples that we currently have. Right? So the example, as I've sort of already said, that like, for example, in the way that Starbucks can sense your device and send coupons to you or give you free email in exchange for data that you provide to them about your location. And then all of a sudden we're going to start to see iTunes getting into the same game with cochlear implants. That doesn't seem to me too far-fetched. But of course we can imagine that it's not just going to be iTunes and those kinds of providers that are going to be interested in, right? That's my favorite doctor up there. It's a small picture, Bones McCoy. Damn it, Jim! Anyways, the docs are going to be interested in all of this too. And already at my university, I'm involved in some projects with doctors who are trying to build the early precursors to what some people have over the past couple decades called the Internet of Things. But this idea of remote monitoring systems, where all of these kinds of things can be queried remotely so that people don't have to be in physical places like hospitals. They can have care remotely through these kinds of devices, which will, I suggest to you, become part of the network. I imagine also the police will be interested in the same things. Wouldn't they be interested in some of that medical and health information flowing through the system with respect to things like elevated heart rates, blood alcohol levels, and the like? So I'm, again, being a little bit provocative here in sort of imagining how some of this might go, but I think it's important to start thinking about the fact that these issues arise with this kind of merger. And so what we see in many ways, and what I've been talking about in my research for a number of years now, is that there has been an important evolution of the network. We have gone from a network which started out in the early days of the internet as being thought of as a network of ideas, of people sharing ideas through sharing computer infrastructure. And that network of ideas has more recently become envisioned as a network or an Internet of Things. I'm suggesting that through these wearable and implantable devices that we're talking about now, that we're going to have to start thinking about this as the Internet of People as well. And that will have significant kinds of implications, especially in light of the move towards more powerful infrastructures for the internet. I know every computer scientist in the room knows what that stands for, but in case, am I right that some of the legal studies people don't know? Shake your head if you don't know what it is. IPv6 stands for Internet Protocol version 6. And one of the reasons for developing this protocol was a recognition that the current internet only has a fairly limited number of nodes on the network. Not quite enough nodes so that everybody in the world gets a unique address. What IPv6 does is it drastically expands the capability of the internet in terms of nodes or points of uniquely identifiable points within the network. And the number is enormous. It's 3.4 times 10 to the 28. That's 340 undecillion addresses instead of like 5-6 billion, something like that. So it's a huge expansion. When I first started thinking about the implications of this theoretical leap in the infrastructure, one of the things that occurred to me is I better try and find a way to explain how big that number is to people. And so I asked one of my grad students to think about it. He said, like, you mean like taking all of the light bulbs in the entire world and networking them? I said, no, I don't think so. I think it's kind of like crushing all of those and compressing them into a teardrop, taking that teardrop, putting it in the ocean, something more like that. Let's come up with a better number. So one way of describing how large that number is, the number is large enough to assign 7 unique nodes or identifiers to every atom in every human body in the world. That's what we could at least theoretically network with this capability. I'm not saying we're going to start the project tomorrow, nor do I think we're going to even network all the Coke bottles in the world, as some people have suggested. But it's really important to sort of start to think about the power of what we can do once we have this kind of capability. And in thinking about that, I want to take this back to this human-machine merger that I'm talking about, and in particular the way in which my field, which is tech law, technology law, is now becoming integrated with health law. And health law people can't really do what they used to do without thinking about these kinds of technologies, I would argue, and vice versa. We're going to really have to think about the health implications if we care about these kinds of things. So in thinking about that, I want to sort of take it back to the cochlear implant example that we were talking about and say a little bit about that. So currently, the way things work is that the process for obtaining cochlear implants requires going to an ear, nose, throat specialist, which requires getting a reference from your doc, going there and having that person diagnose you as having had experienced profound hearing loss. And the reason for that is what I described earlier. You're not entitled to, in Canada, to have cochlear implants unless you have profound hearing loss, and the reason is because the process itself requires severing the auditory nerve, which means it's a one-way road, there's no going back. So you go through this process, and in starting to get one of my research assistants to think about what the rest of the steps of the process were, 2 things I noticed. One was it was very hard to get information about what that process is if you're not a potential person for implants. And second of all, even if you were, it's very hard to get a hold of the documentation you would need, the legal stuff, the stuff that I'm interested in as a lawyer, for seeing what happens here. And what I found out is that one of the steps along the way, eventually, I threatened to do a bunch of access to information requests to get this information. I talked to the people at the 3 main cochlear providers. They said there was no such thing as the legal documentation I was looking at. They said there isn't such a thing. Eventually I got it through the hospital systems because in Canada, of course, hospital systems are public and to some extent answerable to access to information requests. One of the things you need to do, this I found out quite surprisingly, to get cochlear implants is to go through a step of a product registration. Okay? So what we're talking about here is a patient label. Read unique identifier tracker for the device. And these things are often couched in terms of being important for warranty purposes. But all of a sudden, people who wear these devices have exposure to all sorts of tracking that other people wouldn't necessarily have access to. And one of the most interesting things that I found out, which is at the time of going through this process and going through all of the consents, right? The typical consents you would do for a health procedure, consenting to treatment, et cetera, et cetera. As you sign off all those releases, one of the things you sign was a document that I was told doesn't exist, which is the terms of service contract of the same sort that every one of you has clicked I agree for whatever computing devices you use. And so this was my hypothesis, and I saw it bearing itself out, which is we're going to start to see these medical devices modeled on mass market consumer goods. And what does that mean for society if that turns out to be the approach that's adopted? So that's kind of what I was interested in and stemming from my work in sort of learning about the process. Now, in thinking about this and in thinking about the way that the traditional regulation of medical devices works, it's important to understand that, in fact, medical devices don't have significant regulation beyond a very low sort of threshold for things. So the way I see it, there's kind of 3 layers of regulation for medical devices. The first layer is related to the device being marketed and sold as a medical device, for which there is legislation that governs. In the US, it's the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. In Canada, it's something called the Therapeutics Product Directorate, the TPD. And this legislation plays an important role in the way that medical devices are marketed. But the threshold for examining whether we will allow people to have licenses to sell these things is a low threshold where the emphasis is on basic safety and efficacy. So if you implant this device into a person, will it cause them to get cancer? Or will it somehow threaten their health in some way? Those kinds of things. The Therapeutics Product Directorate and the FDA have no interest and no expertise in thinking about broader issues like privacy. Right? And so that's why, for example, in the United States a few years ago, the FDA approved a human implantable RFID chip. They didn't want to take on the social issues. They just said, as far as we know, this thing doesn't cause cancer. Turns out that it does. In any event, the next sort of main kinds of regulation that are in place here are intellectual property. But one of the things about intellectual property as a legal regulator is that it, in fact, as people who build stuff will know, IP is actually an enabler of the device makers and the device providers. In other words, it doesn't provide an oversight mechanism which would check on concerns about human autonomy or privacy or anything like that. What it does is it provides patents and trademarks and the like so that people can actually be enabled in the research, development, and promulgation of those devices. The third sort of rough area that deals with this, which is the area I'm going to focus in for the rest of my time, is the consent issue. Okay, so we do have a fairly robust law around consent to treatment. And we also have a fairly significant set of cases and rules around what lawyers like to call EULAs. Okay, legal studies students, write this one down. The EULA. The EULA is an end-user license agreement. And I would argue that the end-user license agreement governs medical technologies more than anything else. And that's what I want to talk about, in essence, with my remaining time in starting to think about this. The hypothesis that I had in starting to do this work, and what I continue to think, is that the business model for mass market consumer devices will be the one that prevails here. And so it's very interesting to think about what happens, for example, what regulates your legal relationship with device providers that you buy devices from in the world of mass market consumer goods. And there's a bunch of stuff, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. Some of it is dealt with in terms of the proprietary nature of the software for those people who design software in that way. Others, as I've said, is governed by the EULA, and I want to talk some more about that. Others is governed by wrapping a layer of technology around the device so that it can only be used in particular ways, a digital lock, if you will, what lawyers tend to call digital rights management systems, which layer permissions for the user through the technology, and thereby limit what might otherwise be legally available to you because the technologist can wrap a digital lock around you and prevent you from using it in that way. And the last one, which I won't talk much about, but which is important here, is this notion of planned obsolescence. In other words, the way that Bill Gates made all of his money was realizing that I don't sell one computer or one software system, I have it updatable all the time and upgradable all the time. I build obsolescence into the system. So I want to talk mostly about the end user license agreements. And what I would suggest to you is that it's important to pay attention at the time of the consents that are going on for consent to treatment to these end user license agreements that I remind you the three major providers told me did not exist. I talked to general counsel at all three providers. Nobody had any documentation to share with me. But I did get a hold of one. And before I get to that, though, I just want to sort of say the way we deal with these kind of things is through a contract, what lawyers call a standard form contract. And my sort of little jingle for what a standard form contract is, it's a form of mandatory volunteerism. I like these kinds of oxymorons, right? Jumbo shrimp, military intelligence, academic fraternity. My favorite was the turbo firefly, but that's a car from an era gone by. In any event, what we start to see here is things like this. This is the notice at the Ottawa airport that I jotted down, not on this trip, but on a trip similar to this, right? Security measures are being taken to observe and inspect people. No passengers are obliged to submit to a search of person or goods if they choose not to board the aircraft, okay? We may well think it's a good thing that we're searched in airplanes and airports. That's not my point here. My point here isn't about security. My point here is about the way that we couch things in contractual language. We take on a posture as though these things are all matters of choice, when really what we know is that the way standard form agreements work is that you have no choice in the matter. It's a form of mandatory volunteerism. Why does every one of you go scroll, scroll, click, I agree, scroll, click, I agree, click, I agree, without reading the terms of service? One, because they're frackin' long and too hard to understand. If I stopped and did that every time I wanted a service, I would not be able to use any of the services that I wanted. I'd be too busy reading contract documents. And two, the second reason is really because we recognize that even if I didn't like some of these terms in my terms of service with Facebook, am I going to get Zuckerberg on the phone and start negotiating the contract with him? It's not going to happen, right? So here's where we sit with these so-called consents. Is that in essence, the terms and conditions are made by the device providers, and we either use the devices or we don't. And there's nothing beyond that. Just to give you a sense of this for some fun, I've been sort of thinking for a long time about these egregious terms and conditions. This one's actually a fun project. This project actually just sort of says that nobody actually reads these documents. And this was by a company called PC Pitstop. What they decided to do for fun was to bury in their licensing agreement this clause, which basically said, if you see this and you send us an email, we'll give you a reward. And they had $1,000 and they wanted to give it away to whoever saw it first and clicked, I agree. They have thousands and thousands of people looking at that web page every day. And it took almost a year, it took more than 6 months before they gave the money away because nobody read that and nobody wrote to them and say, I read that. So you start to see these things are not often used. This is a perhaps more famous end-user license agreement. How many people in the room know about the Sony rootkit debacle? Some of you, I won't get into the details of it, but in essence, Sony wrote a little piece of software that it put on its music CDs that allowed ET to phone home and report to the mothership what your user habits were in watching that. There was a huge outrage about this, and they said, well, we did it, it was legal. It was in our terms of service. Here's the provisions. That are from there. Interestingly now, we all succumb to that sort of stuff. We happily sign up for Apple iTunes Genius if you use those kinds of things, and which collect more information than the rootkit ever did because it's really convenient. It gives us good indications of other music we might like, but that's a separate story that I won't talk about. The point here is obviously these kinds of devices, which are legal devices, are not really effective in terms of trying to get actual consents from people. That clause alone, it's not a contract, it's just a clause within a contract. That clause alone is more than 3,000 words. What are the length of your essays that you're writing these days? Well, Edgar Allan Poe was able to tell the tales, the 1,000 injuries of Fortunato in the cast of Amontillado in something like less than 2,400 words by my count. So I say shame to the lawyers for writing these long documents and the problems that are inherent in them. And I speak to lawyers about that all the time. I'm actually not going to get into, for the sake of time, what goes on there. But what you start to see here is this kind of mandatory volunteerism. And you can just sort of take a look at what they're saying here. All of a sudden, any update that's deemed part of the software for purposes, if you fail to install it, all of a sudden you lose the rights to terminate for anything under the EULA. And so there's these really egregious terms that you start to see that are out there. This is one of my favorite ones. I'll just share it with you quickly from Hilton Hotels. One time I was staying in a hotel and I actually decided to read the policy. It subsequently has been changed because a lot of us raised a big fuss about it. But it says, you agree that Hilton Hotels shall own all information. This is in the emails you're sending using their email service. By using the service, you voluntarily, expressly, and knowingly acknowledge and agree with all of the foregoing and further agree to each of the following. I think that's redundant, but maybe I've said that before. Such information belongs to Hilton Hotels. It's not personal or private proprietary information, all of a sudden, hocus pocus. Such information, whether collected, wherever collected, may be processed, used, reproduced, modified, adapted, translated, used to create derivative work, shared, published, and distributed by Hilton Hotels in its sole and absolute discretion, in any media and manner, irrevocably, in perpetuity, in any location throughout the universe. These lawyers were so greedy that, like, the Milky Way wasn't enough. They needed more. Okay, so you start to see these kinds of maximalist opportunities to basically take what the law provides, to allow the law to give you certain rights and create certain obligations, and then automatically take it away. How? By the hocus pocus that the standard form agreement creates, by, in essence, having you waive all of those rights you would have, whether they're privacy rights or otherwise, through these terms of service. And these things are perfectly legal and totally enforceable. And what I can say to you is, to date, EULAs have not been very privacy friendly. Clearly in the mass market consumer goods, and I would suggest to you as well with some of these ones. So when I teach contract law, one of the first things you teach students about contract law is this notion of freedom to contract. Well, I want to turn that on its head and say that, at least in the context of these bodily devices that we're talking about, what we need is not freedom to contract. We need freedom from contract. We need rules that limit what contracts can do for corporations and device providers that take that kind of aggressive approach of the sort that I've told you. So, as many of my colleagues have written about this, and I won't get deeply into the quotes here, but as Dan Solov and others say, using default contract rules isn't sufficient to remedy the problem because it doesn't address the underlying inequalities that govern information transactions. Namely, that somebody else gets to write the contract, you don't get to negotiate it, and the only way that you get that service is by clicking I agree. Right? So Dan Solov says that. Paul Schwartz says something very similar in his work. Julie Cohen says something very similar. She says the greatest obstacle to effective legal protection around privacy of intellectual consumption is not imperfect fit with the available legal theories, but the fact that the theory gives way to contract in many, if not all, circumstances. So as these people and I have put it, and I said it like this, end user licenses are becoming the rule, and those who get to draft them become the rule makers. This is a real problem in the law. And it's a problem which exacerbates, people say to me, what are the biggest privacy problems that are caused? What's the technology that causes the most privacy problems? I don't think it's those devices and the fact that they transmit personal data. I think it's the contracts that govern those devices. So I've been working around trying to figure out some legal reforms in this. And first, before I just mention something about that and end off the talk, just another example of this. So what you see here is the agreement that doesn't exist that I ended up finding through my hospital about the bionic ear. And this is the full agreement. And what that tells me right away is that this is a nascent terms of service agreement. Right? This does not have the sophistication and the lawyerly input of the Hilton Hotels type language. But what you do see here are that all of the basic techniques which were used in mass market consumer goods are also being used here. So for example, what the coverage indicates is that, for example, and looking just to take one example so as not to take you through the whole thing, there's a series of provisions that say conditions that void the service agreement. And in essence, what these provisions do, same as mass market consumer goods, it says if you use our product and you bundle it with somebody who's not one of our partners, if somebody makes an aftermarket product that works better than the one we provide for this and you decide you want to use that, you void the warranty. Okay? Only we're not now talking about the warranty for our iPods, we're talking about the warranties on our ears, right? There's no going back on that one. And if you go through these agreements, provision by provision, you start to see very similar kinds of things like that. In addition to not being able to bundle them with non-partners' products, another one is that if you use it in a way that it doesn't accord with the user's manual, which of course you don't get user's manuals anymore, you have to download them from the internet. If you use them in an unauthorized way, that will void the warranty. And so we start to see all of these kinds of restrictions here that are coming because I think the lawyers who are drafting this are just saying, well, what kind of license should we have? Well, why don't we look to the licenses that are available? We'll look to boilerplate provisions in standard form agreements. And what we start to see here is this is what's happening. So this is sort of the story of some of the research that I've been interested in. And it's going to become more and more important as we start to see more and more of these devices coming to market. This is sort of the next generation, well, the existing generation of bionic limbs. You saw Oscar Pistorius run on some fairly stiff prosthetics. These knees and ankle joints all are locationally aware. They have an ability to sense their environment, whether somebody's walking uphill up some stairs and whatnot. And the next generation of these devices, just like the cochlear implants, are going to be totally internet enabled. They're going to interact with all sorts of other devices that will have tremendous tracking and monitoring. And if you think that this set of issues is one which just lends itself to the amputee community, I think you're thinking wrongheadedly about this kind of thing. As I suggested at the beginning, there is a growing body of people who are interested in the idea of devices like this which aren't to restore lost function, but are just used to enhance existing function. And so we'll wear these devices and we'll implant these devices, at least certain portions of the population will, with a view to the cool kinds of things that it enables us to possibly do. All of these things will come with their own digitally embedded sets of permissions, and from my perspective, equally importantly, end user license agreements with terms of service in thinking about this. So I think it's really important that we start to think about this, just to show you, and I'm not going to go through it, similar kinds of warranty exclusions. I showed you the one with the cochlear implant before. This is the one for the bionics that I told you about. All those same provisions in there about void warranties if not used in the way that the user wants to use it. And I'm more than happy to share this slide set with anybody who wants to take a closer look at some of these slides. So in thinking about that, and I'm not going to talk about DRM to this audience very much, but I do want to sort of finish off. Maybe I'll just say something to the legal studies students for just a moment. So the idea here, as the technology students know all too well, is that norms and values can be embedded into the architecture of our systems. You really have to think about that. Many times the temptation is to think of a technology as neutral, right? Guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? The technology itself is neutral, it's only in its use. But there's a growing and very mature field of science and technology studies that has thought very deeply about that question. And there is a growing field of values in design and how we can embed values in design. And just to give you one quick example of this, this is Robert Moses. He was instrumental in the designing of the modern aspects of New York City, including the bridge systems in and out of New York, and in particular, the routeway to Long Island. So one of the things that Robert Moses did, and which was going to be his legacy, was he built this place that was called Jones Beach. Jones Beach was meant to be an exclusive beach for wealthy people in Long Island. And Robert Moses didn't necessarily want that beach to be spoiled and cluttered by other people coming to that beach who he didn't sort of perceive as part of his vision. So he knew a little bit about this stuff that I'm talking about here, and he built the highway system out around that area, and this is one of the overpasses. It's a sort of standard kind of fairly neutral, builds into the environment, nice stone. One of the things you don't notice necessarily about that particular overpass is it's just a little bit lower than standard overpasses. Just low enough that a public transport bus cannot fit under that. Okay? And what he realized is by building certain things into the architecture, you can build architectures of exclusion. And in this case, that along with changing the zoning laws around the trains, making them only not passenger trains, he was able to go a fair way in not allowing certain people to easily get out to Jones Beach. So we have to really start thinking about the way that technology is embedding these kinds of architectures. I stay at hotels all the time now, where the only way that you can get out of the elevator on the floor that you're staying on is by having a pass key. So nobody else can actually get to that floor. I teach in classrooms which won't enable me to turn on the system unless it's at a time when the university knows that I'm supposed to be in that classroom. We're building these kind of things into our systems. I won't even talk about the Kindle in this context because time is out. My main point is this: DRM is already running in some of these kinds of devices that I've been talking about. And this is one of the three big cochlear implant providers, the Nucleus. And what you start to see is they're already able to bundle services around particular kinds of products. You might not like the sound of screaming babies. I have a 2-year-old. And you might want to have a system which filters out that kind of noise. You might want to be able to hear each other across a restaurant, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that these things may be very useful settings on a digital device. I have no problem with that. But you can also think about these kind of things being bundled in particular ways that really limit the kind of use that people have of the devices that are now so integral to their lives in the decisions that they've made. And so we see that with not only the cochlear implant, we see that with the Rio knee as well, and I could go on, but I'm not going to. I'm not really even going to talk about the proposed reforms because there's just a few minutes left, and I know people have to head to other classes, but I would be happy to take a quick question or two to the extent that people want to stay in the room and talk about either that or whatever else you want to talk about. Thank you. Well, you've hit on what I think is a really interesting question, and I know it's very hard because a lot of people have to leave, so I'll just talk loudly for the people who are interested and want to hear the answer. The question was basically, how do we deal with this new world where all of a sudden we're implanting inside of the borders of traditionally what counts as the body and the person, and yet we're putting these technological devices. How does that change things in terms of the way we think of as where does the person end and the device begin? Well, one of the things that I tried to show in this presentation, which I hope became clear to you, was that in fact all of a sudden now, whereas prior to the implantation of that device, we would think that we have complete autonomy over the choices we make of our body, other than perhaps some limitations that currently exist in the state. Now, all of a sudden, parts of my bodily function are actually governed by an end-user license agreement that is part of the intellectual property of a device owner who probably never sells me that device so I own it, but probably only leases it to me so that I rent it in terms of the way that that contract is worked out. So the short answer is that all of a sudden, the entire realm of what counts as the body is problematized by this kind of device. The question was, am I aware of any legal challenges to the sorts of issues that I've raised? And the answer is, no, I'm not aware of any. And yes, I'm mounting a case. I'm trying to think of the right case to bring this kind of issue. To me, let me tell you one of the reasons why I've started thinking about this stuff. And that is because, to me, this example is the more powerful version of the example of the same problem as it already exists in the copyright space or in the privacy space. And what I wanted to sort of show that it's not just, as my colleague Michael Geist, who's amazing on this stuff, his big complaint back when this issue rose for the first time, when the government was trying to protect people who were putting digital locks on things, his big complaint was that he wasn't able to download the Coldplay album from one device to another. My first question is why he wanted to download Coldplay. But more seriously, one of the things that I thought was that maybe not a compelling enough example from where we're going, because that might be trivial compared to where we're headed. And so it seems to me that I'm looking for the right kind of test case to sort of show that medical device providers who use this kind of model and who are modeling things on a mass market consumer good have overstepped the role of what a contract and what a license is supposed to do. And this, to me, provides the best reductio ad absurdum for that model. I'll try to answer that question. I think I can answer it fairly briefly, but first by sort of giving you an example of the case you're making. There's a fairly well-known technologist. He's an electrical engineering professor in Toronto who's very interested in some of the performance art around these kinds of things, named Steve Mann. And Steve Mann, for example, has a T-shirt which basically has a EULA on it, and it says, by reading this shirt, you agree to this, that, and the other. To try to show how ridiculous it is that this kind of mechanism could actually work. The short answer to your question is because the lobby around intellectual property and also its entrenchment in law has become so significant that as soon as this kind of thing, which isn't a hammer but is something which is software driven, runs on software, there's a lot of people who think that that software still needs to be protected by intellectual property. I'm among the people who think that software of all sorts, there should be rules governing the use of software. However, I think it's overstepping the bounds to do what the kind of examples that I've shown here. But really, this is an intellectual property-driven agenda, and I think that's why you don't see it with hammers. Yeah?
I'm afraid we're out of time. So let's thank Ian Kerr for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.